Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome at Villa Paola and the European University Institute. My name is Anca Cretu, and I'm a Max Weber Fellow in the Department of History and Civilization.
Hello, and I'm Milica Prokic, also a Max Weber Fellow at the Department of History and Civilization.
Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Marie-Janine Calic, who will give the Max Weber lecture later in the day. And we'd like to thank you for agreeing to this interview. I know you have a very busy day, and we'd like to introduce Professor Calic very briefly. She's a professor of Eastern and Southeastern European History at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. And she's the author of many books, and we'd like to note the 2019 published in English A History of Yugoslavia, and The Great Cauldron, A History of Southeastern Europe, as I mentioned, published in English in 2019. So we'd like to start with a few questions, primarily based on these two books and these publications. The first question I'd like to point, I'd like to point to your narrative of The Great Cauldrons particularly, and the idea of interactions, interrelationships, and experiences that transcend borders, as you mentioned in your book, and particularly in The Great Cauldron. And my first question would be, what drove and sustained translocalism, transregionalism, and later on transnationalism in your study?
Actually, there were so many phenomena which transcended borders, the imperial borders or later national borders. Think of trade, think of migration, of ideas. So the idea that space was something closed is actually wrong. There were so many mobile groups already in earlier times. Pilgrims, tradesmen, sailors, travelers of all kinds who were actually traveling long distances, many by foot, and they met other cultures and other people and returned with new ideas and new acquaintances. So I think that the idea that transcultural or trans-border phenomena are something linked to the empire is actually wrong, because people used to be very mobile and they used to have communication and exchanges across borders.
Does technology play a role in various forms? For example, the invention of the press.
Sure, modern technology played a role because it made possible to travel long distances with ships, with train. The printing press helped spreading ideas and ideologies. So of course, but it's not that the modern age actually invented these trans processes, but these were actually inbuilt, I think, in any culture, and so they were also in Southeastern Europe or the Balkans.
Okay. And going into the idea of borders, I was particularly taken aback in your book about the sub-theme of borders, because they're quite fluid and malleable. And to what extent can we talk about this fluidity, to a certain extent? How does this shape the trends in various forms, the transnationalism, transregionalism, translocalism, or it can be used, their fluidity helped the movement of people, for instance, and to what extent did this fluidity encourage nationalist discourse, for instance?
Yeah, actually there were both sides of the coin. Many areas were multicultural, multi-religious, many people lived together, used to live together, and naturally had exchanges across cultures and religion, and also languages. There were many regions which resembled more to contact zones than actually borders, also because they changed the political the empires, and many people, even in modern times, used to live in several empires or states, because empires dissolved and then there were wars, and territories changed from one state to the other. So many people had this experience of belonging or of an identity which was mixed for more or less historical or, if you wish, natural reasons. But then also in the 19th century, when nationalism came up and the national movements were actually competing for territories, these mixed areas became objects of contestation. And at this stage, through the lenses of nationalism, multiculturalism was seen as something dangerous because the nation was seen to be, or there was a perceived need to create a homogeneous nation. So the others were actually excluded, and there were different ways of excluding the others, either by expulsion, forced migration, or by assimilation. I believe that as a rule, one could say that the weaker a state, the weaker a newly emerging national state was, the more hostile it was towards the others, the more the state was striving to create homogeneous regions, and the more it was striving to fix the borders and actually understand borders as something which should not easily be crossed, but would protect the nation from perceived hostile forces.
They become static in a way, like they become quite frozen through this nationalist discourse, and they're just kind of given, right? So that would be my interpretation, at least, right? So,
yes, sure, and this is because there were no ethnic or clear-cut ethnic and cultural borders. So when nationalism or different nationalisms were actually fighting for territories, they used the nation and the population who lived there as an argument to conquer certain territories, and that became very violent and very, very exclusive.
Yeah. Another aspect of your book is, and what I particularly like, analysis of urban areas and just kind of this movement of people and how, and ideas and how that is part of various urban centers across the region. And this, can we look into the story of movement as an only through the urban lens, only through the lens of the elites, though? I mean, this is something that is something that I also grapple with in the research, and I think that is when we look at writings, who adapts these writings and where they get adapted. For instance, the writings of the 18th century and the 19th century. Can we talk about this as a story of elites or urban centers only?
The urban centers were key to these processes because it was the urban environment where you found the educated, where you found the books, where you found the most mobile groups, so people who were actually able to travel, and they had the idea that they should discover the world or have these exchanges with other urban centers. And yet also the villages and the people living in distant places were somehow involved in these processes. I could actually find no one single group which was only living in one place and had no exchange, even not the villagers, because at a certain stage the local economy got integrated in larger processes of trade, of monetary economy, economic relationships were developing, and in that even the villages and even people on the countryside were somehow getting in contact with other cultures and forces, unwillingly often, but this happened. So the idea that the urban was something open and having all these exchanges is true, but it is also true that the countryside was, to a lesser extent, but it was also involved in very similar processes. And look, in the 20th century, when even the peasant movement started to get international, in the 1920s, the peasant parties created the Green International. So even the peasant movements were recognizing that their concerns could be addressed only in a larger, like transnational or international level, and that they were not purely national or rural concerns, but this related to much bigger processes and questions.
Actually, my next question is really related to the 20th century and more or less even the 19th century. And speaking of this idea of transnationalism, to what extent, for example, nationalists can use transnational tools to on behalf of their agendas? And I think here about, for example, the international organizations, in particular after the First World War, or the use of aid, for instance, after the wars, platforms, speeches, and ideas that can get adapted or instrumentalized within a particular nationalist context. Can we talk about this side of the coin a little bit? Do you think that's a...
I think that one could see that in the 20th century the nationalism is somehow being internationalized, in the sense that the nation state or national governments are using international organizations or, let's say, exhibitions like the World Exhibition and other stages to present the own nation and to showcase what the nation is, and building images. In that, nationalism cannot be or cannot work without these outside world and without channels through which self-images are being processed and exposed to the larger world.
Hello.
Thank you for the discussion about the isms and many dimensions.
Isms, yeah.
And then I think Milica will look a bit at the Yugoslavia case.
Thank you very much, and hello again. I think maybe we can see what isms spilled into this book as well. But primarily, I would like to ask you, Professor Calic, about the motivations to write such a comprehensive history of a very tumulus region, or famously or infamously tumulus region in a very tumulus century. So it's no small feat. You cover a history of a century in the southeastern Europe, in what was Yugoslavia, over 100 years, where many things took place. And in the introduction, that's very brief and very well packed, you say also that the need for such a comprehensive history arises from the disproportion between a history like this and the history of Yugoslavia that speaks specifically about the atrocities and the civil wars of the 1990s and its very tragic collapse in the 90s. And you, in your book, insist on a continuum. So tell me about sort of the desire behind and the inspiration to write this book to begin with, and then we'll take it from there.
Well, the original inspiration was to write the history of one European country about which not so much is known and which is often forgotten when it comes to writing European history,
Yes.
be it in a comparative perspective or in any other perspective. I feel there was really a gap in history writing, and to a certain extent still is. Yugoslav history is something for the experts, and traditionally the experts for the region are considered to be expert for something strange, unusual,
Yeah.
if not suspicious. So, and I wanted actually to address Yugoslav history from questions which we ask to European history as a whole, and I wanted to see where the Yugoslavia story actually fits in larger processes. And I found that there were so many developments in European history in which Yugoslavia would fit perfectly in. For instance, I'm German, and in Germany one idea is that after the Second World War there was an economic boom which made Western Germany prosperous again after the Second World War, and this was something exceptional. But look, Yugoslavia had a very similar economic boom, even a bigger boom. And so we can see there are many parallels actually in history, and there's no such thing as an exceptional Yugoslav or Balkan history. And the second idea was to demonstrate that Yugoslav history was, one shouldn't understand Yugoslavia only from its end. So many writings start actually from the violent dissolution of the state, as if this was a natural thing to happen, and Yugoslavia was an artificial state, which I believe it was not, but there were very clear arguments and causes and processes which made the state collapse, and actors were responsible for that. So I wanted to show that over 70 years the state was existing, and there were good reasons why it existed, but there were also good reasons why it was so complicated and so conflictuous history, which at the end of the day made the state collapse. So if you wish, I wanted to normalize or broaden the framework of understanding this complicated country.
Yes, so from your answers stem a couple of other questions that I wanted to ask you originally as well, so why not right now? The 70 years of Yugoslavia, it's so the kingdom, the one that was founded in 1918, and then the one that collapsed in the 1990. To many Yugoslavs, these Yugoslavias were fundamentally different because they were ideologically founded on different things. Kingdom and the Socialist Federative Republic to begin with. And to some people there is only one Yugoslavia, and that's the Socialist Federative Republic. And I'm talking about former Yugoslavs and some others in the area as well. But in the vein of looking at this comprehensive continuum, you choose to look at Yugoslavia as one unbroken sequence. And I would like to know methodologically what's the rationale.
Well, the idea was to write the history of one country, and it's very practical that it had a natural beginning and a natural end, because before 1918 there was no such state as Yugoslavia. Never in history has it existed, but it existed as an idea. It has existed for 100 years, from early 19th century, when the first intellectuals started to think about nation and culture, and they thought that Slavs in the region actually originated from one ancient people called the Illyrians, that in ancient times they represented one people which for a tragic fate had been dismembered, for which reasons then the Croats ended up in the Habsburg Empire and the Serbs in the Ottoman Empire, and so on and so forth. That for these reasons they had different names and religions, but originally that is what the nationalists believed, were one people, which now in 19th century could be reborn as a Yugoslav nation. So the first thing is that this idea of Yugoslavia was a historical fact which emerged from the region. It was an original idea, actually starting in Croatia, but then spreading to other regions as well. We often read that Yugoslavia was founded in 1918 because the great powers did so and because they didn't know about the region and about the people. This is untrue, because the Yugoslav movement was there and there was a lobby for it, and the protagonists, the politicians, Serbs, Slovenes, Croats, were actually lobbying in the capitals in London and Washington and Paris that the great powers should agree to found the state, which then actually happened in 19. Yet the idea in the first Yugoslavia was totally different from the idea of the second, because in the first Yugoslavia, the national ideology said that Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, and everyone else was just one nation, which had different names and religions, but basically one nation, that it could be merged, that it was one. Accordingly, the state was organized in a centralist way, so there were no republics or states, federal units, as it existed later. And this led to a Serb dominance in the state. The dynasty was Serb, there was preponderance of Serbs in the military, in the police, in administration, and so on, and it created big frustrations among the others, which already then were considered to be separate nations or people. At least the Croats believed that they were already a people. The second Yugoslavia, then under communist rule by Tito, had a totally different idea of this Yugoslavia. They were also very fond of Yugoslavia, but not as a unitary state, because the communists recognized different nations and peoples and recognized that each of these peoples should have their own republic and their own little statehood under the umbrella of big Yugoslavia. There was a different idea about what the nation is. Instead of one unitary nations, the communists thought there were different nations and nationalities. Instead of centralist rule, there was federalism, and instead of monarchy and parliamentary, bourgeois, capitalist economy, there was a communist. But the idea of the two states was the same. It was at the same time idealistic, thinking that these different people could live together under very different conditions. Yes. It was also pragmatic, because both the more liberal or conservative politicians in the pre-war period and then the communists thought that having a larger state like Yugoslavia would provide better economic development possibilities, greater security towards aspirations of the great powers to conquer territory, so that it would actually help all people to benefit from this larger state. Yet, as we now know, both states had tremendous internal problems because the country was just so diverse, not only culturally but also in terms of social and economic development, and from this emerged conflicts which needed to be mitigated, mediated, negotiated, and this was a very large task which at the end in the 1980s, after Tito had passed away, actually led to the breakdown of the federation and the dissolution of the state.
Certain portions started pulling in many different directions, yes. So from this answer again, the longevity of the idea is actually your thread of Yugoslavianism is where you hold this continuum, and in this context you bring it in back to Europe, as if it went anywhere from the continent physically at any point. So from this stems my next question, which is this southwestern Balkans as the European savage mother, not quite European part of Europe. And it seems like in your book, the spirit and the thesis is that this is something that needs to be challenged. That in this very turbulent, indeed, area, we have, yes, some extreme things that have happened, but then if we think about the savagery of the 20th century in Europe in general, we see much more developed countries with some fundamental problems. The rise of Nazi Germany, for example, the human exhibits in zoos in Belgium as late as 50s, the medical castration of people for homosexuality in the UK, and the list goes on and on. This is just some of the most blatant and readiest examples. And yes, your book seems to challenge the view that within Europe we have this mini Orient in Sadic kind of way. And yeah, I would like you to expand on this, please, if you will.
Yeah, this is a very long
And loaded,
complicated,
yes, absolutely.
complicated phenomenon to explain. But I mean, the idea that the Balkan was something very violent and backward, exceptional emerged in the 19th century when the Ottoman Empire was dissolving and nations started to fight for their own national states, and they were competing for territories, as we heard, doing all kinds of cruelties and so on. This created in Western minds the idea that the Balkans was a metaphor actually for savagery and barbarism and cruelty and whatever. Yet, if we put it in comparative perspective, one can see that such cruelties and wars happen when any political order is dissolving. So it went along the dissolution of the big empires in the so-called Third World. It went along any kind of dissolution of larger empires or state, because the institutional order breaks down. There is no monopoly over violence anymore, no institutions which would put order, and this leaves room for actors of all kinds, the military, but also other forces who fight with violence for their aims. Like it or not, all European states emerged through wars, but this in much distant history often. We tend to forget that. There's a new book by German historian Dieter Langewiesche about the war, and he speaks about war as the teacher. The war is a teacher, and he explains why actually nations continue to fight wars, because they wanted to establish nation states, and he claims that without war there wouldn't have been any nation state. Actors believe that the nation state was the political entity that needed to be built in order to achieve prosperity, well-being, even peace, but before that one needed to fight for it. And this is actually what happened in the Balkans in the late 19th, early 20th century. The only thing is that nation building in this region came later. It was delayed as compared to earlier European state and nation building processes, so that the public somehow perceived these nation building wars as something backward and not modern and not belonging to the contemporary world.
Yes, the Balkanization. Yeah, we can hear it as a synecdoche, and it's pretty global. People talk about Balkanization of Britain, for example. Gordon Brown said that in 2007, fearing for the animosities rising over Scottish independence. We have people talking about the Balkanization of certain parts of the African continent, of Iberian Peninsula as of late, and so the Balkanization is always this, brings this notion of divide with animosity. But it seems that your book also points towards, for these animosities to even happen, things need to become cohesive and come together.
I suggest not using this term of balkanization at all, because it carries so much negative connotations about the Balkans, about something bad and cruel and savage and so on and so forth. It also carries the idea that the big empires would be something better than the national state, and I would strictly object to that notion, because in the big empires there was no self-determination for the people, there was no political participation, there was often economic exploitation, so there was actually good reasons to fight for the national state if you were belonging to one of these subjugated people.
Absolutely.
Balkanization also in a way tends to justify, or this term Balkanization, to justify colonial rule. As if colonialism in Africa or Asian other continents was something peaceful and good for the people, and the contrary is actually the case. So this is why I caution against this term of Balkanization, which I think in many respects is very misleading.
Yes, absolutely. That's why I wanted to discuss it briefly with you, because it's an Anglophone term that's very, very rarely actually used within the Balkans. People from the Balkans, others from the Balkans don't use it, but the onlookers do, and yeah, there's a dissonance. I'm glad we cleared this up. And so, in terms of bringing together all of these threads, and in terms of the audience that you anticipated for this volume, for your book, this is a very general question, but I think it might yield some really interesting insights from you, at least I hope. What were the challenges at presenting this very complex history to people who don't necessarily know more than about the 90s, about the region? And what would be the single most important takeaway for somebody who first encounters the past of this area?
Okay, I mean, the challenge is, like in any book, is finding the narrative. And finding the narrative for a national state which is homogeneous is less challenging, I should say, than finding the narrative for a state which was composed of many different peoples with different historical traditions and ethnic and cultural orientations, which is actually a multi-faceted and multi-dimensional history. So to be fair to these different traditions and cultures and agents, I think this was quite challenging to find the narrative and not to be too to argue too much from the center, from Belgrade and from official policy and from the ruling elites, but also look from peoples
Yeah.
ideas and livings and so on. This is why I introduced these chapters on everyday life and people's experiences and how people lived actually together also in a multicultural environment. So I think that the social and economic history and cultural dimensions help overcoming these challenges, because then you ask also for shared experiences of people through war, but also through economic boom and through happiness and new experiences.
Yeah, I was more narrowly thinking about your readership. A takeaway maybe that, did you think in this way?
I did think in this way.
If Yugoslav picks up a book, or if a German picks up a book, or somebody who...
Actually, the first takeaway, or the first message is that Yugoslavia was not artificial. It was not an artificial state, but as I said before, it was an idea and a movement and a reality which was not imposed from above or from the outside world, but it was an idea originating from the region, and that it was driven and then later destroyed by actors in the region. So it was not an artificial thing. And having said this, I also wanted to show that the dissolution of Yugoslavia was a reality, but it did not necessarily need to happen this way. But there were actors making decisions, and decisions could have been taken in a different way. Nobody ever, or it wasn't clear from the beginning that if there was a conflict over constitution, over economy or anything else, or the dissolution of the state, that you should send the army, that you should commit atrocities. So history was reversible, and each and every person had a room for maneuver, could make decisions, politicians, military generals, and each person could decide how to behave. So there's no teleology in this whole story, and no exceptionalism.
Great. Thank you very much for all the answers, and thank you very much for your time. And we're looking forward to your lecture.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Calic.